The name Frank Matthews carried weight in the streets of New York, Philadelphia, and beyond. By 1973, he had built an empire that stretched across the eastern seaboard, a network so vast and efficient that it made him one of the most powerful drug kingpins in America. He was only 30 years old, but his reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Frank was different from the Italian mobsters who had dominated the heroin trade for decades. He was a black man who refused to bow, refused to pay tribute, refused to accept the old rules that said he should stay in his lane and be grateful for whatever crumbs fell from their table. Frank Matthews didn't look like a typical street hustler. He carried himself with the confidence of a CEO, dressed in tailored suits that cost more than most people made in a month, and spoke with a clarity that betrayed his intelligence. He had started with nothing, growing up in the projects of Durham, North Carolina, where poverty wasn't just a condition but a cage designed to keep you trapped forever. But Frank had seen through the bars early. He understood that the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended, just not for people who looked like him. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Frank had already established connections that would make him legendary. He traveled to Las Vegas, to Los Angeles, to Miami, building relationships with suppliers from the French Connection, and later with South American networks that would soon flood the country with cocaine. He was a visionary in a business where most people couldn't see past the next corner. While others fought over blocks and neighborhoods, Frank thought in terms of regions and distribution networks. He employed hundreds, moved millions, and did it all with a level of sophistication that law enforcement struggled to comprehend. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been watching him for years. They had files, photographs, wiretaps, and informants. But Frank was always 3 steps ahead. He used multiple identities, changed locations constantly, and trusted only a tight circle of associates. He paid people well, treated them fairly, and demanded loyalty in return. Those who betrayed him disappeared quietly, a lesson that only needed to be taught once. The streets understood the rules of Frank Matthews' world. You could get rich working with him, or you could get buried working against him. But by early 1973, the walls were closing in. The DEA had been formed just months earlier, consolidating federal drug enforcement efforts under one powerful agency. They wanted a big win, a scalp to hang on their wall to prove they were serious about the war on drugs. Frank Matthews was the perfect target, high-profile, successful, and worst of all, independent. He didn't answer to the mafia, didn't pay them a cut, and that infuriated the old guard who saw the drug trade as their birthright. Frank knew they were coming. He could feel it in the way conversations ended when he entered rooms, in the nervous glances of people who used to look him in the eye. Informants were everywhere, turning on their friends and partners for lighter sentences or cash payments. The game was changing, becoming more dangerous, more unpredictable. He had already started moving money, establishing safe houses, creating exit strategies. Frank Matthews hadn't survived this long by being reckless. He understood that empires could crumble overnight, that power was always temporary, that freedom was the most valuable commodity of all. On a warm July morning in 1973, Frank was in Las Vegas with his girlfriend Cheryl Denise Brown. They were staying at a hotel on the Strip, enjoying the illusion of normalcy that money could buy. Frank had been contemplating his next move. He had stashed millions of dollars in various locations, had connections in countries without extradition treaties, and had the resources to disappear if necessary. But leaving meant abandoning everything he had built, meant admitting defeat, meant letting them win. He sat in the hotel room that morning, smoking a cigarette and staring out at the desert landscape. Cheryl was still sleeping, her breathing soft and rhythmic. Frank's mind was calculating, always calculating. The feds had arrested several of his associates in recent weeks. They were building a case, connecting dots, following money trails. It was only a matter of time before they came for him directly. He had bail bondsmen on retainer, lawyers who specialized in making problems disappear, but even Frank knew that this time might be different. The knock on the door came at 6:47 a.m. Frank knew immediately what it meant. He had been expecting this moment, had rehearsed it in his mind 1,000 times. He stubbed out his cigarette, walked calmly to the door, and opened it without hesitation. Federal agents flooded into the room, guns drawn, voices shouting commands. They handcuffed him roughly, reading him his rights in that mechanical way that cops do when they've done it so many times it's become routine. Frank said nothing. He had learned long ago that anything you say can and will be used against you, so the smart play was silence. He watched as they tore through his belongings, cataloging evidence, taking photographs. Cheryl was awake now, wrapped in a sheet, her eyes wide with fear. Frank caught her gaze and gave her a slight nod. She understood they had talked about this possibility. She knew what to do. They transported him to a federal holding facility, processed him through the system with all the bureaucratic efficiency of a machine designed to strip away your humanity, fingerprints, photographs, cavity searches, each procedure designed to remind you that you were no longer a person but a number, a case file, a problem to be solved. Frank endured it all with the same calm demeanor he brought to business negotiations. Show no weakness, give them nothing. The bail hearing came quickly. Frank's lawyers argued that he was a businessman, a legitimate entrepreneur being targeted because of his race and success. The prosecutor painted him as a dangerous criminal mastermind responsible for flooding communities with poison. The judge, an older white man with tired eyes, set bail at $5 million. It was an astronomical sum designed to be impossible, but Frank Matthews wasn't a typical defendant. Within 24 hours, the bail was posted. Frank walked out of federal custody, a free man pending trial. But freedom is relative when you know they're watching your every move. Frank returned to New York to the apartment in Brooklyn where he sometimes stayed. The city felt different now, smaller somehow, like the walls were pressing in. He met with his lawyers, reviewed the evidence against him, and understood the reality of his situation. The feds had testimony from informants, financial records, surveillance photographs. The case against him was strong, possibly unbeatable. His associates whispered in worried tones. Some suggested he should run, disappear into one of the foreign countries where he had established connections. Others argued he should fight, that he could beat the case or at least negotiate a deal. Frank listened to everyone and trusted no one. He had been in tight spots before, had navigated situations that seemed impossible, and had always found a way through. But this felt different. This felt final. On July 4th, 1973, Frank Matthews attended a meeting in Brooklyn. He arrived in a car driven by Cheryl, carrying a briefcase that contained over $300,000 in cash. The meeting was supposed to be about business, about maintaining the network during the legal proceedings. Frank shook hands, made promises, gave instructions. He was calm, focused, completely in control. When he left that meeting, Frank Matthews walked into the humid New York evening and vanished from the face of the earth. The disappearance of Frank Matthews sent shockwaves through law enforcement that would reverberate for decades. Within hours of him failing to appear for a scheduled meeting with his attorneys, the FBI realized what had happened. Special Agent John Connolly, who had been leading the investigation into Matthews for 3 years, sat in his office staring at surveillance photographs spread across his desk. He had known Frank was a flight risk, had argued for higher bail, had warned his superiors that this man was different from the usual street-level dealers they prosecuted. But nobody had listened, and now the biggest drug kingpin they had ever targeted was gone. The Bureau mobilized immediately. They issued federal warrants, contacted Interpol, alerted customs officials at every port and border crossing. They raided known associates, squeezed informants, followed every lead, no matter how thin. Cheryl Denise Brown had vanished with him, leaving behind an apartment full of expensive clothes and jewelry, but taking nothing that mattered. Frank's network of safe houses, stash locations, and business fronts were hit simultaneously in a coordinated sweep that yielded some evidence, but no Matthews. What frustrated the feds most was how cleanly he had disappeared. This wasn't a panicked flight, a desperate man making stupid mistakes. This was planned, executed with the same precision Frank had brought to building his empire. He had anticipated this moment, prepared for it, and when the time came, he had activated an exit strategy that was already in motion before they even realized he was running. In the weeks following his disappearance, tips flooded in from across the country and around the world. Frank Matthews had been spotted in Montreal, in Mexico City, in Caracas, in Lagos, in Paris. Every sighting was investigated, every lead followed to its dead end. The truth was that nobody knew where Frank Matthews had gone, and those who might have known weren't talking. The code of the streets held firm even as the feds offered deals, immunity, and cash rewards. Agent Connolly became obsessed. He plastered Frank's photograph on wanted posters across the country, listed him on the FBI's most wanted list, and worked 18-hour days chasing ghosts. In his more honest moments, usually late at night with a glass of whiskey, Connolly admitted to himself that he respected Matthews. The man had outsmarted the entire federal law enforcement apparatus, had beaten them at their own game, had walked away from an empire worth tens of millions of dollars rather than spend his life in a cage. The streets had their own theories about what happened to Frank Matthews. Some said he was living like a king in some South American country, protected by corrupt officials he had been paying for years. Others claimed the mafia had finally caught up with him, that he was buried in a landfill somewhere in New Jersey, payment for his refusal to bow to their authority. A few whispered that he had made a deal with the feds, that his disappearance was staged, that he was in witness protection somewhere, living a quiet suburban life under a new name. But those who knew Frank Matthews, who had worked with him, who understood how his mind operated, they believed he was alive and free. Frank had always been too smart, too careful, too prepared. He had seen men get caught because they were greedy, because they stayed too long, because they thought they were untouchable. Frank had avoided all those mistakes. He had taken his money, taken his woman, and taken his freedom before anyone could take them from him. The investigation continued for months, then years. The feds never stopped looking, never closed the case, never admitted defeat. They followed rumors to dead ends, investigated sightings that led nowhere, pressured associates who knew nothing or said nothing. The file on Frank Matthews grew thicker, filled with speculation and theory, but devoid of any solid evidence about his whereabouts. 5 years after his disappearance, Agent Connolly sat in that same office, now decorated with commendations for other cases, other victories. But the photograph of Frank Matthews still sat on his desk, a reminder of the one that got away. Connolly had come to accept that he would probably never know what happened to Matthews, would never get the satisfaction of putting handcuffs on him again, would never hear a judge sentence him to the decades in prison he deserved. The confrontation that mattered most hadn't been between Frank Matthews and the FBI. It had been between Frank Matthews and the system itself, the machine designed to crush men like him, to channel people born into poverty toward one of two destinations, prison or the grave. Frank had understood the game better than most, had played it brilliantly, and when the board turned against him, he had simply walked away from the table. His former associates who got caught, who went to trial, who were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms, they understood what Frank had done. Some resented him for it, felt abandoned, cursed his name from behind bars. But others, the ones who truly understood the game, they respected the move. Frank had beaten the unbeatable system, had achieved what every hustler dreamed of, but almost none accomplished. He had gotten away with it. The money he had hidden was never recovered. The feds estimated he had stashed between $15 and $20 million in various locations, a fortune in 1973 that would be worth 10 times that in future decades. They searched properties, dug up yards, interviewed bankers in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Nothing. Frank Matthews had taken his empire with him into the shadows. In the criminal underworld, Frank Matthews became a legend, a ghost story told to younger hustlers about the man who beat the feds. His name was spoken with reverence in barbershops and pool halls, on street corners where the game was still played. He represented possibility, proof that escape was possible if you were smart enough, bold enough, prepared enough. The mafia families who had resented his independence, who had wanted to force him to pay tribute or eliminate him entirely, they also wondered about his fate. Some claimed they had nothing to do with his disappearance, that Frank had simply outsmarted everyone. Others hinted darkly that scores had been settled, that the old ways had prevailed. But no bodies were ever found, no concrete evidence ever emerged to support those claims. Cheryl Denise Brown, the woman who had vanished with him, was equally untraceable. She had been Frank's partner in the truest sense, understanding the risks, accepting the lifestyle, and when the time came, executing the escape plan with him. Some investigators theorized they had separated after leaving the country, that it was easier to stay hidden alone than together. But those who knew Frank believed otherwise. He had been loyal to those loyal to him, and Cheryl had been more than just a girlfriend. She had been his confidant, his partner, his co-conspirator in the greatest vanishing act in criminal history. The confrontation in the end was philosophical rather than physical. It was Frank Matthews's refusal to accept the predetermined ending that society had written for men like him. The feds wanted him in a cage, wanted to parade him as proof that crime doesn't pay, wanted to use him as a warning to others. But Frank had written his own ending, one where he controlled his fate rather than letting it be controlled by judges and prosecutors and agents like Connolly. In the decades that followed, occasional rumors would surface. A man matching Frank's description spotted in some distant country. A cryptic message passed through criminal networks that some interpreted as proof he was alive. An unexplained financial transaction that bore the hallmarks of his sophisticated methods, but nothing concrete, nothing definitive, nothing that could be confirmed or verified. The FBI officially maintains that Frank Matthews remains a fugitive wanted for drug trafficking and fleeing prosecution. His case file is still open, though the agents who originally pursued him have long since retired or died. New generations of federal investigators occasionally review the file looking for something their predecessors missed, hoping to be the one who finally solves the mystery. But the truth is that Frank Matthews had won. He had beaten the system at its own game, had refused to accept the only two options it offered, and had created a third option through intelligence, preparation, and timing. The confrontation wasn't about violence or force. It was about will, about refusing to be captured by a destiny that others had designed for you. His legacy lived on in the streets and the stories and the knowledge that escape was possible if you were willing to pay the price and make the sacrifices. Frank Matthews had walked away from everything, his business, his empire, his identity, and in doing so, he had won the only victory that really mattered, his freedom. The official investigation into Frank Matthews' disappearance consumed resources that the newly formed DEA could barely afford to spare. Task forces were assembled and disbanded. Agents followed leads that evaporated like desert mirages. The paper trail Frank had left behind was meticulously constructed to lead nowhere. Bank accounts had been emptied days before his disappearance. Properties had been signed over to shell corporations that existed only on paper. The vehicles registered in his name were found abandoned in various locations, wiped clean of fingerprints and evidence. What emerged from the investigation was a portrait of a man who had understood better than anyone that the game he was playing had only two endings for most players, death or imprisonment. Frank had studied both outcomes extensively, had watched friends and rivals fall to bullets or gavels, and had determined that neither would be his fate. He had spent years preparing for the moment when he would need to vanish, setting up contingencies, establishing identities, moving resources to places beyond the reach of American law enforcement. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts painted Frank Matthews as highly intelligent, strategically minded, and utterly pragmatic. He lacked the ego that brought down so many criminals who achieved success. While others bought flashy cars and jewelry, threw lavish parties, and drew attention to themselves, Frank had always maintained a lower profile. Yes, he dressed well and lived comfortably, but he never flaunted his wealth in ways that made him an obvious target. He understood that survival required discipline, that the moment you believed you were untouchable was the moment you became most vulnerable. The informants who had testified before the grand jury, who had provided the evidence that led to Frank's indictment, found themselves in an uncomfortable position after his disappearance. They had betrayed a man who was now beyond the reach of justice, but not beyond the reach of reputation. In the criminal underworld, the fact that Frank had escaped made their testimony seem not just traitorous, but foolish. They had turned on a legend for deals that now seemed worthless, had traded their credibility for prosecutorial promises that couldn't be kept because the main target was gone. Several of these informants requested additional protection, claiming they feared retaliation from Matthews' remaining associates. The feds provided what protection they could, relocating some, providing security for others. But the reality was that Frank's organization had largely dissolved after his disappearance. Without his leadership, the network fragmented. Some associates continued operating independently. Others retired from the game. A few were arrested and prosecuted on the evidence that had been gathered. The financial investigation proved particularly frustrating for federal authorities. Forensic accountants tracked money through a labyrinth of accounts, transfers, and transactions that spanned multiple countries. They estimated that Frank had generated somewhere between $100 million and $300 million during his criminal career, astronomical sums for the early 1970s. But most of that money had vanished along with Frank himself. The feds managed to seize some properties, freeze some accounts, but it was a fraction of what they knew existed. What troubled investigators most was the possibility that Frank had help from within the system. How had he known exactly when to run? Who had tipped him off that the net was closing? The investigation turned inward, looking at court personnel, law enforcement officers, anyone who might have had access to information about the timing of arrests and prosecutions. Nothing concrete was ever proven, but suspicions lingered. Frank had always been known for his ability to corrupt officials, to pay for information, to turn people who were supposed to be incorruptible. The media coverage of the disappearance was extensive, but ultimately unsatisfying. Reporters loved the story of the drug kingpin who had outwitted the FBI, but without Frank to interview, without new developments to report, the story gradually faded from headlines. Occasional feature articles would revisit the case on anniversaries of his disappearance, speculating about his fate, but these became less frequent as years passed and other criminals captured public attention. Within the African American community, Frank Matthews occupied a complicated space. Some viewed him as a destructive force who had poisoned his own people with heroin. Others saw him as a businessman who had refused to bow to white power structures, who had built an empire in a system designed to keep black men powerless. The truth, as always, was more nuanced than either narrative allowed. Frank had been a product of his environment, a man who had looked at the limited options available to someone born poor and black in mid-century America, and had chosen the only path he saw to wealth and power. The psychological toll on Agent Conley and his team was significant. They had invested years into building the case against Matthews, had celebrated when he was arrested, had assured their superiors that conviction was certain. His escape represented a profound professional failure, one that would mark their careers. Conley became known within the Bureau as the agent who let Frank Matthews get away, a reputation that stung despite his successes in other cases. The case files eventually filled several boxes stored in a federal facility, thousands of pages of reports, surveillance logs, financial records, and investigative dead ends. Periodically, when a credible tip came in or new information emerged, agents would pull the files and review them, looking for connections they had missed, angles they hadn't explored. But each review ended the same way, with the files being returned to storage and Frank Matthews remaining at large. Some investigators developed theories that Frank had died soon after his disappearance, possibly killed by former associates or foreign criminals who had decided his money was worth more than his friendship. Bodies matching his description were investigated in various countries, but DNA testing was primitive in the 1970s, and none of the bodies could be definitively linked to Matthews. The theory persisted among some agents that Frank's bones lay in an unmarked grave somewhere, that he had achieved his freedom only briefly before meeting a violent end. But others, particularly those who had studied his methods most closely, believed he had successfully reinvented himself. They imagined him living quietly in some country with weak extradition treaties, perhaps running a legitimate business, maybe even having started a new family under a new identity. The resources he had would have allowed him to live comfortably for decades. The discipline he had demonstrated throughout his criminal career suggested he could maintain a low profile indefinitely. The legal proceedings against his co-defendants continued without him. Some were convicted and sentenced to substantial prison terms. Others cooperated with authorities, providing additional details about Matthews' operation in exchange for leniency. These cooperators described Frank's business acumen, his attention to detail, his insistence on loyalty, and his ruthlessness toward those who betrayed him, but none could provide useful information about where he had gone or how he had managed to disappear so completely. The emotional aftermath for those Frank left behind was complex. Associates who had depended on him for their livelihood suddenly found themselves without direction or protection. Some successfully transitioned to other criminal enterprises or legitimate businesses. Others struggled, unable to replicate the success they had achieved under Frank's leadership. A few harbored resentment that he had saved himself while leaving them to face consequences. His family members, those who were still alive and could be located, claimed to know nothing about his whereabouts. Most seemed genuinely in the dark, having been kept at arm's length from Frank's criminal activities. The feds interviewed them repeatedly, hoping someone would slip up or reveal something useful, but nothing emerged. Frank had compartmentalized his life effectively, keeping his family separate from his business, protecting them through distance and ignorance. The international dimension of the search proved particularly challenging. In the 1970s, cooperation between American law enforcement and foreign police agencies was limited. Many countries lacked the resources or motivation to search for an American fugitive, especially one who might be bringing money into their economy. Corrupt officials in some nations actively hindered investigations, either because they were being paid by Matthews or because they resented American interference in their internal affairs. As the years accumulated, the active investigation gradually wound down. The task force was dissolved, agents were reassigned to other cases, and the search for Frank Matthews became a cold case that was reviewed periodically but never solved. The wanted posters remained posted, the warrants remained active, and his name remained on various fugitive lists, but the intensity of the manhunt faded. The punitive aspect of his disappearance was that Frank Matthews could never return to the life he had known. He couldn't contact old friends, couldn't visit family, couldn't reclaim his identity or reputation. He had traded everything he was for freedom and accepted permanent exile as the price of avoiding prison. In that sense, he was serving a life sentence of his own design, one without walls but with boundaries just as real. The years turned into decades, and Frank Matthews remained a ghost. The 1970s gave way to the 1980s, then the 1990s, and still there was no confirmed sighting, no credible evidence of his fate. The world moved on, but the mystery endured. Law enforcement theories evolved with changing technology and investigative techniques. When DNA databases became standard, some cold case investigators revisited unidentified bodies from the 1970s, hoping to finally close the Matthews case. None matched. The mental fortitude required to maintain a hidden identity for decades is extraordinary. If Frank Matthews was indeed alive and free, he had to resist every impulse to reconnect with his past. He couldn't attend funerals of loved ones, couldn't celebrate successes with old friends, couldn't correct the record when people told stories about him that weren't true. He had to accept being frozen in time, remembered as he was in 1973, forever 30 years old in the public imagination, even as he aged in secret. For a man who had built his identity on reputation and respect, this erasure must have been psychologically challenging. Frank Matthews had been someone important, someone powerful, someone whose name commanded attention. In Disappearance, he became nobody, or perhaps somebody else entirely. The ego death required for such a transformation would test even the strongest personality. Yet if he had survived, it meant he had passed that test, had found a way to build meaning and purpose outside the structures that had previously defined him. The criminal landscape changed dramatically in the decades after Frank's disappearance. The crack epidemic of the 1980s brought new players and new violence to the drug trade. The Colombian cartels rose to power, moving cocaine in quantities that dwarfed Frank's heroin operation. Later, Mexican organizations would dominate the trade, operating with levels of brutality and corruption that made the 1970s seem almost quaint by comparison. Had Frank remained in the game, he would have faced competition far more violent and sophisticated than anything he had encountered. In that context, his decision to walk away looked increasingly wise. Many of the kingpins who rose to power after him ended up dead or imprisoned. The Medellin cartel's Pablo Escobar was killed in a shootout. The Cali cartel's leaders were arrested and extradited. Mexican cartel bosses were captured or killed in military operations. The few who managed to retire peacefully did so only after decades of bloodshed and constant paranoia. Frank had avoided all of that by recognizing when it was time to leave. The psychological recovery from a life of crime, assuming Frank achieved it, would have been a gradual process. He would have needed to develop new patterns of thought, new ways of evaluating risk and making decisions. The hypervigilance required for criminal enterprise, always watching for threats, always calculating angles, always preparing for betrayal, would have to be unlearned. The transition from a life where violence was always an option to one where problems were solved through conventional means would require fundamental rewiring. If he established a new life somewhere, he would have needed to create a complete backstory, a fictional biography that explained his presence, his resources, and his past. This fabricated identity would need to be robust enough to withstand casual scrutiny while avoiding the kind of attention that invited deeper investigation. It would mean living with constant low-level deception, maintaining a persona that was close enough to his true self to be sustainable but different enough to avoid recognition. The loneliness of such an existence would be profound. Every relationship would be built on partial truths, every friendship constrained by what couldn't be shared. If Frank had reinvented himself successfully, he would have spent decades knowing that no one truly knew him, that the most significant chapter of his life was one he could never discuss. The memories of his empire, his victories, his narrow escapes, all of it would have to remain locked inside stories that could never be told. Yet there might have been freedom in that anonymity, released from the burden of reputation, from the need to project power and maintain fear. Frank could have explored aspects of himself that the drug kingpin persona had suppressed. He could have been gentle where he once had to be ruthless, vulnerable where he once had to be invincible, honest where he once had to be calculating. The person he became in hiding might have been more authentic than the legend he left behind. The mental discipline required to maintain operational security for years, then decades, would be extraordinary. One slip, one moment of nostalgia or carelessness could unravel everything. He couldn't use old slang that would date him, couldn't reference experiences from his real past, couldn't let his guard down, even with people he grew to trust. The constant vigilance would become second nature, a permanent modification to his psychology. Money, while important, would be the least of the challenges. If Frank had successfully moved even a fraction of his estimated wealth, he could live comfortably for life. The real challenge would be finding purpose and meaning divorced from the empire he had built. Many successful criminals who attempted to retire found themselves bored, restless, drawn back to the game not by financial need but by psychological addiction to the lifestyle. Frank's ability to stay vanished suggested he had either found new sources of meaning or possessed unusual psychological resilience. Some psychologists who studied the case theorized that Frank might have used his business acumen in legitimate enterprises under his new identity. His skills in organization, logistics, and personnel management would transfer to legal businesses. Imagining Frank Matthews as a successful, legitimate businessman somewhere using the same talents that built a criminal empire to build a legal one had a certain poetic justice to it. The system had tried to cage him, and instead he had potentially joined it under new terms. The passage of time itself became Frank's ally. With each passing year, the number of people who remembered what he looked like diminished. The agents who had pursued him retired and died. The informants who had testified against him aged and disappeared into their own forms of witness protection. The criminals who had worked with him either ended up in prison or moved on with their lives. The world's memory of Frank Matthews faded from specific to general, from a real person to a legend, from a wanted fugitive to a historical curiosity. By the turn of the millennium, Frank Matthews would have been in his 50s if he was still alive. The ambitious 30-year-old who had built an empire was decades gone. In his place, if he existed, was a middle-aged man with a secret, someone who carried within him the knowledge of having beaten impossible odds, of having won a game that almost everyone loses. That knowledge, that private victory, might have sustained him through whatever challenges his new life presented. The recovery from being Frank Matthews to being someone else would never be complete. Some part of him would always be the man from Durham who had refused to accept poverty as destiny, who had built an empire through intelligence and will, who had walked away when others would have stayed and fought. That core identity couldn't be erased, only covered, transformed, redirected toward new purposes. The legacy of Frank Matthews exists in multiple dimensions, each revealing different truths about the man and the system he defied. In law enforcement circles, he remains the ultimate cold case, the one that got away, a reminder that even the most powerful investigative apparatus in the world has limits. FBI and DEA training materials occasionally reference the Matthews case when teaching about fugitive psychology and the importance of financial surveillance. He is studied, not celebrated, analyzed, not admired, but his success in evading capture commands a grudging professional respect. In the criminal underworld, Frank Matthews achieved a form of immortality. His name is invoked when discussing the greatest drug traffickers in American history, mentioned alongside figures like Pablo Escobar and El Chapo, but with one crucial distinction: he was never caught. That singular fact elevates him in the mythology of crime. Every hustler who dreams of getting out clean, of beating the odds and retiring rich, sees Frank Matthews as proof that it can be done. Whether he died free or lived free, he never gave the system the satisfaction of his capture. The philosophical dimension of Frank's legacy centers on questions of agency and choice within constrained circumstances. He was born into a society that offered limited pathways to success for poor black men in the mid-20th century. The legitimate economy largely excluded him. Education was inadequate, and the social safety net was threadbare. He looked at those circumstances and chose a third path, one that was illegal but lucrative, immoral but effective. Then, when that path led toward inevitable imprisonment, he chose a fourth option that no one thought possible: complete disappearance. His story challenges simplistic narratives about crime and punishment. The system wanted him to serve as an example, to demonstrate that crime doesn't pay, that justice is inevitable. Instead, Frank Matthews demonstrated that the system's grip is not absolute, that individual will and intelligence can sometimes overcome institutional power. This is an uncomfortable truth for a society that wants to believe in the inevitability of justice and the futility of crime. The racial dimension of Frank's legacy cannot be ignored. He operated during an era when the American drug trade was transitioning from Italian mafia dominance toward more diverse participation. Frank's refusal to pay tribute to the mafia, his insistence on operating independently, represented a broader assertion of autonomy that had racial implications. He saw the old rules as designed to keep people like him subordinate and simply refused to play by them. Whether in prison or paradise, he never submitted to those rules. For the African American community, Frank Matthews remains a complicated figure. The heroin he distributed destroyed lives in communities, contributing to the addiction epidemic that devastated inner cities in the 1970s and beyond. That harm is real and cannot be dismissed. Yet his success in building a black-owned criminal enterprise at a time when black economic power was severely limited, and his ability to outsmart a system designed to control and confine black men, made him a figure of fascination and even pride for some. The question of whether Frank Matthews is still alive becomes less important than what his story represents. If he died soon after disappearing, he still achieved his goal of avoiding imprisonment and controlling his own fate. If he lived for decades under a new identity, he demonstrated that reinvention is possible, that your past doesn't have to determine your future. Either way, he escaped the ending that society had written for him. Current estimates suggest that if Frank Matthews is alive, he would be in his 80s. The vigorous young man who built an empire is long gone, replaced by someone elderly, perhaps reflecting on a life that spanned multiple identities, multiple realities. The psychological burden of such a life is difficult to imagine. The secrets carried, the truths never spoken, the relationships built on necessary deceptions. There's a certain tragedy in perfect success. Frank Matthews won so completely that he had to erase himself to preserve that victory. He couldn't write memoirs, couldn't set the record straight about his life and motivations, couldn't claim credit for his achievements. His legacy is defined by others, by law enforcement who portrayed him as a villain, by criminals who elevated him to mythology, by journalists who speculated about his fate. The real Frank Matthews, whoever he became after 1973, remains unknowable. The internal victory Frank achieved was choosing freedom over reputation, anonymity over infamy, life over legacy. He understood that the empire he built was ultimately worthless if he couldn't enjoy the fruits of his labor. So he abandoned the empire, took what he could carry, and built something new in the shadows that required a psychological strength that rivals his strategic brilliance, the ability to let go of everything he had been and embrace the uncertainty of becoming someone else. For those who study his case, Frank Matthews offers lessons about the limits of institutional power, the importance of preparation, and the value of knowing when to walk away. He never got caught because he never believed he was invincible. He planned for failure even at the height of success. He cultivated exit strategies while others were celebrating victories. That combination of ambition and prudence, of boldness and caution, is what separated him from the countless criminals who ended up dead or imprisoned. The enduring mystery of what happened to Frank Matthews may never be solved. Perhaps that's fitting. Some stories are more powerful, incomplete, more meaningful as questions than as answered facts. Frank Matthews exists now primarily as an idea, the idea that escape is possible, that the system can be beaten, that you can write your own ending even when others are trying to write it for you. If he's out there somewhere, an old man with a secret, perhaps he sometimes allows himself to remember. Perhaps on quiet evenings he thinks about the empire he built, the risks he took, the victory he achieved. Perhaps he feels satisfaction at having beaten impossible odds, or perhaps he feels lost for the life he had to abandon. Perhaps he's found peace in obscurity, or perhaps he still looks over his shoulder after all these years. The truth is unknowable, and that mystery is part of the legacy. Frank Matthews disappeared so completely that he became a ghost, a legend, a cautionary tale, and an inspirational story simultaneously. He demonstrated that the most secure prison is the one you never enter, that the most important form of freedom is the kind you preserve by walking away from everything else. In the end, Frank Matthews' greatest achievement wasn't building a criminal empire. It was understanding that the empire was temporary, that power was fleeting, that the only victory that mattered was maintaining his freedom and autonomy. Whether he enjoyed that freedom for days, years, or decades, he died on his own terms rather than the system's terms. For a man who started with nothing in the segregated South and rose to become one of America's most powerful criminals, that final act of defiance may have been his masterpiece. The lesson of Frank Matthews is not that crime pays. Most criminals end up imprisoned or dead. The lesson is about understanding the game you're playing, recognizing when the odds have turned against you, and having the courage and preparation to do what others think is impossible. He saw the cage being constructed around him and walked out before the door could close. That moment of perfect timing, that synthesis of preparation and opportunity, that willingness to sacrifice everything he had built to preserve the one thing that mattered most, that is the legacy of Frank Matthews. He haunts the system still, not as a person, but as a possibility, as proof that total control is an illusion, that individuals can sometimes outmaneuver institutions, that freedom, true freedom, is worth any price. Whether resting in an unmarked grave or living quietly in retirement, Frank Matthews won. And that victory, that escape, that refusal to accept the predetermined ending, that is what makes his story eternal.